Welcome to Night City, where today we're not going to Night City, but instead we're going into space, as we're looking at the two supplements dealing with near orbit and interplanetary adventures, near orbit and deep space. Near orbit was for the 2013 version, while deep space expands it and replaces its predecessor for 2020. It opens up the game to replicate classics like Outland, Total Recall, or Saturn III. Just remember it's a lot easier to die in space than on land. While you ponder the fact that just a few miles overhead everything is trying to kill you, remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment because YouTube likes that, so I like that. I'm Mr. Welch, and today we are blasting off. Near Orbit was published in 1989, with lead credit going to Mike Pondsmith and the cover art by Doug Anderson. It's only 88 pages, just over half the length of the much more expansive Deep Orbit. It's set 10 years before its successor and goes into the various near-orbit sites, including all the Lagrange points as well as the Moon. It introduces the numerous elements of living in space that makes playing these campaigns much deadlier, as you have to monitor a lot of variables like air, radiation, and gravity. It goes into some detail on the various locations in orbit, from the Crystal Palace space station to the various satellites and the two moon bases. Then it goes on an adventure that takes up half the book, so the book is more 44 pages of rules and 44 pages of adventure. Then you move on to Deep Space. This book repeats and updates everything from Near Orbit. The only reason to grab Near Orbit is if you already have Deep Space, is to complete the collection, or for the adventure as all the rules and background are repeated. Deep Space was released in 1992 by Chris Young and Scott Hedrick, and Doug Anderson again did the cover art. It's 140 pages long, with 58 pages devoted to a tacked-on adventure. Again, a massive chunk of the book is devoted to just the adventure. I don't mind adventures at the end of a source book, but when the adventure takes up a third to half of the source book, it tends to reflect that they didn't have enough material for the core book and the adventure was there to pad it out. Now, launching into Deep Space, the first thing you'll notice is the book is set in 2025, making it one of the only books not set in 2020, with Rough Guide to the UK being the only other book in this category that I can remember. It was directly updated from 2013 in the History Guide, and it adds new space stations, the Mars colony, and details the High Rider Revolution very briefly, where the Galileo cylinder declared independence after a brief war. The setting also expands to the asteroid belt and to Jupiter's moons, so if you want to recreate the Expanse setting, Deep Orbit is right there for you. The book goes into great and sometimes gruesome details on how everything will kill you in space. It gives you numbers on how long you have to fix something before you freeze to death or suffocate in the cold vacuum. It hammers home the point that Sir Isaac Newton is the deadliest man in space, as the laws of motion in zero-G work together to kill you. So don't use guns in space. That is all. There's a lot of math in this section, as Cyberpunk is a hard science game, though it doesn't go into the advanced algebra that some of the worst games are more guilty of. The math tells you exactly how much time you have left before the air escapes and what happens when the air depletes. Even if you do make it out, you're probably sacrificing some brain cells to the cruel mistress of vacuum. The next deadliest thing is radiation, and there's a whole chart of what amount of radiation will kill you in what amount of time. Radiation does require you to keep track of your total dosage, and the results are both cumulative and horrific. Go make your players watch Chernobyl a couple of times to hammer the point home that radiation is a very bad thing. If you ever wanted to keep track of your character's chances for cancer, then Deep Space has you covered. Radiation kills brutally fast, something that the book reminds you constantly. There's rules for birth defects, genetic damage, hair loss, cataracts, and electromagnetic pulses for those with cyberware. Most of the damage is done in millirads, which actually isn't enough to do any real damage, but when you start taking actual rads, it doesn't take long to get a fatal dose. That's when your face melts off and you die screaming, so wear a rad suit. The third thing you have to keep track of is gravity, and it's the only one that's not immediately lethal compared to the other two. But the lack of gravity is very unhealthy for long periods of time. The body was designed to work in gravity. Without it, parts start to malfunction after a while. Because of this, everyone in space has to either have a vigorous workout periodically or be exposed to artificial gravity. Otherwise, you start to lose body points as your bones become brittle and your various organs start to fail. The book has a large section regarding gear and vehicles. In space, everything works differently. A good chunk of this was cut and paste from Near Orbit and then updated for the 2020 rules. That actually applies to most of the book that isn't the adventure, though Deep Space does expand on the rules a bit, so it's not just the same book with updated stats. Deep Space does add a large number of new vehicles and gears, and the art is greatly improved from Near Orbit as well. There's a section on combat, but it's not the dogfighting that you see in the movies. Ships and satellites are moving at several miles per second, faster than anyone can possibly track by eye. Instead, combat is done through computers that can calculate the trajectories and react at those speeds. All the human element does is to tell the computer what to shoot at and with what. There's a section on the various types of habitats you find in orbit and on other worlds. The information on these are disappointingly sparse because of the wasted opportunities. It talks for a few paragraphs about each of the various types of facilities, from the floating factories to the battle stations. A large number of the factories are completely automated, cranking out materials that can only be created in microgravity. There's hundreds of workstations in orbit, and those are little more than modular space stations used for a variety of reasons. The book has a small section on the 3 orbital colonies: the Crystal Palace, the Galileo Cylinder, and the Paradise Station. Of the 3, only Crystal Palace even gets more than a passing mention. This is one of the failings of the book, as the Crystal Palace is a floating city that is completely self-reliant and utilized by all major spacefaring nations. It gets a single column of information in the book. The other 2 habitats don't even get a paragraph each. Considering that the Galileo Cylinder was a completely independent entity, that was a lot of wasted opportunity. Instead of the 60-page adventure to close the book out, they could have given us 10 more pages on the Crystal Palace. They could have detailed the rebel high riders more, and given us a greater focus on the asteroid miners or the other extraplanetary colonies. There was just too much potential that got left out of this book. There's a section on high rider culture, and again it's quite brief. Because of the hazards of space, they are a cautious group regarding risks and indulgences. A single mistake by one person can kill a lot more people. Drugs are limited. Nobody takes anything that dulls their senses. Smoking is forbidden because air quality is paramount. High riders embrace their cultural communally. They have to work together or very bad things happen. Because of this, personal conflicts are rare. Rivals instead take on job assignments that keep them apart to prevent incidents. The book goes into even less detail on the Moon and the Mars bases. Though Mars is the setting of the adventure at the end of the book, it gives a few paragraphs on the belt miners, which again is disappointing because that's one of the classic settings for cyberpunk science fiction. Even worse are the moon bases that only get a single paragraph each. That's Near Orbit and Deep Space. They missed a lot of opportunities in his books. They could have fleshed out the moon bases, the space stations, the asteroid miners, and the orbital habitats to adventure on instead of the excessively sparse text we get. I would have gladly sacrificed the nearly 40-page adventure for more detail on the locations it did tease. If you want to have a space adventure, you're going to need deep space. It's just that you could have had even more space adventures if the book had lived up to its potential. The book is over on the Artel website for $18. Near Orbit is not on the Artel store, but you can get it for less than $20. There's not a big demand for it on the secondary sites. I'm assuming that a large part of that is because Deep Space completely replaces it, and the 2013 setting is not very collectible. Next up is Edgerunners Inc., as I'm down to 7 videos, and I'm still waiting for my copy of Rocker Boy, which isn't a priority at the moment, as it's a 2013 book compared to a 2020 book. And once I'm done with those 2, it's all adventures from then on out.